Welcome to the Wombat Podcast, Michele. Can you introduce yourself, please?
I live in London. I'm Italian and I came here when I was 18. And my name is Michele Occelli and I work as a hypnotherapist. My first introduction was through a course which I took a long time ago. I was at the time sort of exploring different ways to work with senses and consciousness. And I was exploring it on a theoretical level, not a practical level. I was researching a PhD, and that was sort of my area of interest. And as I was researching this, different things came up. Some of them came from traditions that are societies and traditions that are non-Western, of course, and then some different ones. Who, mainly this one actually came up of looking at what did the West have that was still present, and that had that hadn't been interrupted, that didn't disappear in the Middle Ages or Renaissance or whatever. And then, as I was actually getting a craniosacral treatment that a friend of mine was giving, she was learning how to do it. I just literally had a thought that appeared in my mind, as thoughts sometimes do, out of nowhere, that said that there would be some way of joining the voice and healing together. And at the time, I was feeling very frustrated at the idea of just perusing these things theoretically. And I started feeling a drive to the idea of working with people. And then someone very randomly sent me a flyer, like an email about a course that was going to be held in London for health professionals by this guy who is a hypnotherapist and trains people. And the person who sent me this is a friend of mine who's a psychotherapist. And then I applied and they got me in, and I went there not knowing anything about hypnosis. I mean, I think as most people, why would you know anything about it? I had a very random, vague concept of what it might be, based on what I've seen in films and read in light novels, etc. The only thing I was accurate about in terms of what I believed was that it does bring voice, words and voice together with a therapeutic approach or healing. And then when I went there, I started learning it, in a practical setting, mainly practical setting, and I got very, very fascinated. I just thought it was incredible.
Were you just researching these practices from a theoretical level, or were you experimenting with them on a personal level?
I was doing both. I was trying to research the mechanics, so to speak, and how these practices, what do these practices do? Why do they exist? Why has the entirety of humanity, at every little step of its history, in every civilization, in every community in the world, found ways of basically joining efforts, and sometimes a lot of effort, a lot of focus, a lot of perseverance, to develop practices and systems to access, interesting states of the mind or specific avenues of functioning of consciousness and the body.
So it wasn't just hypnosis, but also altered states of mind?
It was basically trying to understand, how mind and senses, mind and body. I mean, at the time, the formulation in my mind was, I don't think, as refined as I can see it today. But, how do we access certain things through the senses, for the body, and what does that tell us about the mind? And one thing that came out of it was hypnosis, very, very randomly. The other thing that came out is I started training with dervishes to learn this very specific kind of body practice, which is like a Middle Eastern, moving meditation, just to try it out, because what does it mean? When you actually practice these things, what do they do? What happens to your mind? And that was just a continuation of my general concern or interest in what can we do to go to interesting places.
Is there a simple definition for hypnotherapy?
Simply, perhaps, is the difficult part, because it's a complex thing. But let's say that it's one of the ways in which we can piggyback or harness certain kinds of natural physiological and psychological patterns and mechanisms of mind and body to shift from what we would consider the waking state, which is the kind of ideally the state in which we're engaging right now in conversation. You know, the same state that makes me feel like I'm thirsty, I'm going to grab this glass of water, I'm going to drink it. And to shift from that state into a different state, which we call hypnosis in the West. We could use the word trance, because of course hypnosis is practiced in pretty much every part of the world in different ways. And it is a state of consciousness. State of consciousness are very natural things. You know, dreaming is a state of consciousness. Sleep is a state of consciousness. So we constantly go through cyclical alteration of our state of consciousness. You know, during the day, in many different ways, but certainly at night we fall asleep very naturally. It's a very pleasant, mostly very pleasant process. We dream, which mostly is also a very pleasant process. And equally naturally, we can also access hypnosis or trance. Now, hypnosis is the way in which this shift and the process of shifting from waking state to trance has been defined and named in the West. You know, the word came from a Scottish surgeon called James Braid, who coined this word neurohypnosis. Neuro because he has to do, he thought, with the mind and nervous system, and hypnosis because he was inspired by the word hypnos, which is the Greek word for sleep. That's because some people in specific types of hypnotic process will become sort of, will close their eyes and become sort of cataleptic or supine, so they look like they're asleep. And for some people, it might feel like a sleep-like state internally, yeah, but it's not. And it's very much generally not sleep-like at all. So we stayed with this word. And this is about, 18th, 19th century. And this was when, in the West, this practice was formalized as a form of therapy. Which started, it's 300 years old. And it's the first form of psychotherapy. The man who kind of immediately sort of started, of course it must have existed before in different forms, but the guy who kind of put a name to it and formalized it to some level, this man was called Franz Anton Mesmer. And at the time, he called it animal magnetism and then mesmerism, of course, after himself, because, everybody likes to brand things. And Mesmer was the first doctor, the first, physician, who thought that it was a good idea to interact with his patients and to communicate with them. He was the first person who thought communication and interaction, physician to patient, therapist to patient, patient to therapist, is relevant to therapy. And that's how you do therapy, by communication and interaction. And before him, of course, if you were ill and you went to a doctor in the 18th century, they would have dismissed whatever was coming out of your mouth.
So hypnotherapy predated Freudian psychotherapies?
Yes, absolutely. By a long shot. And Freud himself got the idea of the unconscious, or certainly became very, very keen on the concept and the idea of the unconscious, which is one of the most important elements of psychoanalytical thought, because he spent about 8 months in a mental hospital called Salpêtre. And in that mental hospital, this was in the 19th century, he was witnessing the work of a man called Charcot, and Charcot was an hypnotist. And Charcot was hypnotizing them, and he was accessing a way of treating their symptoms extremely effectively, which until then, pretty much nobody could have done anything with. So, so Freud was really, really keen on hypnosis. He was very curious about it. He got a lot of his ideas from witnessing hypnotic inductions. And then later on, he moved away from hypnosis and developed what he called the talking cure, which is just, a different kind of approach, of course. But the first talking cure is definitely Mesmer's idea.
It sounds like there was a period where hypnotherapy kind of went out of fashion. Was that because of the tension or competition from the emerging psychotherapies?
I think definitely that there was a a kind of antagonistic or antithetical sense in the birth and development of psychoanalysis, that hypnosis probably was not a good approach or a good idea, and so hypnosis became more relegated to specific types of medical practices, which kept on utilizing it. Braid, this guy was before Freud, but the man who coined the term hypnosis, he was a surgeon, and at the time surgeons mainly were chopping people's legs and arms off. They were severing limbs because that's, people get into gangrene or they get an infection and septicemia, so they had to be amputated, and there was no anesthesia. Until about 150 years ago, there was no anesthesia. So what Braid discovered is that he could hypnotize his patients, and then he could sever their limbs, he could amputate their limbs, and they wouldn't feel the pain. And he did so on thousands, I think 3,500 people or something like this. Before the utilization of, let's say, hypnoanesthesia or hypnoanesthesia, let's call it that way, people had to be held down by like 4 big guys because they were going to have a saw chopping their limbs off live in the live flesh without anesthesia. So of course, doctors have retained a sense that there is something very impactful and very powerful about hypnosis that has a utility for medical practice. But in terms of psychotherapy, it became sidelined. And then towards the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, it again became very interesting to a lot of people. And now it's becoming even more so because I think the psychedelic renaissance is somewhat sort of resonating with it quite a lot.
What is at the core of hypnotherapy that allows it to perform so many diverse functions?
So this, I think, is a $1 million question, or perhaps $1 billion question. There are a lot of theories on how this works, and there are a lot of studies. Yes. So obviously, the nature of scientific and medical studies is that they are extremely complex in their procedure, in their methodologies, and they deal with very complex phenomena most of the time. And when it comes to the mind, we're going one notch up in terms of complexity. I mean, not that the heart is not complex, but somewhat there are slightly more materially ascertainable mechanism that once we go into the mind become even more difficult to track and to standardize and so on and so forth. So the studies, depending how the study has been built, they bring different results. But what's definitely, I think, consistently coming out is first that the phenomenology, the subjective phenomenology of people experience in hypnosis has been validated. Where before there was a certain kind of dismissal, someone comes up and has a sort of hallucinatory experience or a very powerful physical experience, and their reports were sort of considered to be, not valid. Yeah. Now, because of course the means of observation have improved a lot, so that we're not just using EEGs to track what's going on, on a superficial level of the mind over time, but we're using fMRIs and all kinds of other methods which visualize which part of the brain within the brain become alight, and the mapping of those parts is becoming more and more known. I'm sure we're still at a very low level of what that knowledge is, but there is more vocabulary. Yeah. What's coming up is that what the person reports as being, okay, this is what I'm experiencing. Like, for example, I'm not experiencing pain, or I'm experiencing a greater awareness of peacefulness or calm in the body. Or I am not seeing colors. There's a very interesting study where, subjects were hypnotized, and they were hypnotized to perceive that these very colorful paintings were actually in black and white, different shades of gray. And they come out of the hypnosis and they say yes, or during the hypnosis they communicate, yes, this is gray, this is darker gray, this is lighter gray, etc., etc. While before this could be dismissed as, they're just sort of believing something, a suggestion, and they're convincing themselves. Once you have an fMRI study, they started seeing that actually the parts of the brain that would respond to color were inhibited. So they weren't just communicating, I'm not seeing colors. Their brain was not responding to colors. Yeah. So there's something that this state of the mind, as I'm sure other states of the mind do, this is not the only one, where it allows the brain to work in ways that it doesn't generally work with when we are just in the way, so-called this, whatever we mean by this waking state, i.e. the everyday natural, baseline state. And the way that hypnosis seems to do this is extremely, has a very wide spectrum, which is why it makes it very applicable to a very wide set of concerns. But the reality of it is something happens in the brain, not just in the mind, but also in the brain and in the body, that allows us to do things in a different way when we're in trance, when we're in hypnosis. For example, we can attend to a task and not be self-conscious about it. So our self-awareness changes. And self-awareness is, this implicit self-narrative and explicit self-narrative is what very often inhibits people and stops them from getting to do things. Because you're doing something at the same time, you're judging yourself, you're observing yourself. In hypnosis, one of the first things that happens is there's a kind of dissociation there. So you're doing something, at the same time you're observing it, but you're observing it from a place of non-judgment and somewhat equanimity, which is what, ideally you should achieve, let's say, by doing a lot of meditation. That might take you years to get there. In hypnosis, it can take you 3 minutes to get to that state.
What does a clinical hypnotherapy session look like?
Okay, so I think to break it down in a very simple way, there's two main components, on a very simple level. One is the induction, which literally means the process of inducing someone into a state of hypnosis. And then suggestion, which is the complementary other component of what hypnotherapy works like. Induction it can be a fairly quick process. And all it does is it allows us to shift from this state, which we're supposedly experiencing right now, you and I, and going towards this state, which is hypnotic. And that state will feel very different to different people and look very different. Yeah.
So the transition can look very different, or do you mean the state of hypnosis?
There's a word that some people use, which is the plunge. It's almost as if you're plunging into a different medium, a different, like going from air to water or something, or water to air. You notice that something feels different and something begins to have a different kind of texture. And then that might become more and more overt, more and more noticeable. But the actual internal, phenomenology of how it feels to be in hypnosis might vary depending on how you're working, what you're doing, and so on and so forth. Just like taking, being on psychedelics will vary very greatly to different people. For some people, hypnosis can be very visual.
The induction phase of hypnotherapy seems to be the most featured in, classic movies. What are some of your go-to induction techniques, and what do you do if your reliable induction tools don't actually result in induction in your patient? So
let me say one thing before I explain this part, which I think is very important. Something that Erickson, a very meaningful contributor to the field of hypnosis, an American psychiatrist, sort of discovered, is that we experience microtrances throughout the day. So if you're on a bus or public transport, the public transport is stuck in traffic, it's very hot, there's a baby that is screaming out of his lungs behind you, and you are late, so you're getting stressed, you're getting tense, you are restless, and there's a lot of stuff happening that is very difficult to deal with in that moment. As you're passing something, let's say there's a corner that looks in a certain way, there's a certain kind of light or something, you start going into your mind and you start remembering something you did the year before when you were on holidays in a beach, in a beautiful place. And somewhat your mind then drifts more and more towards the memory material. And as it does that, and this is something everybody has experienced at the point, the awareness of the surrounding space becomes less and less important. The sounds that are around you, they're still there, but you're hearing them less. You're paying attention to them less. The stress about being late starts subsuming, and you go into this interesting memory place, and that place becomes somewhat more real. And your body, becomes more relaxed and so on and so forth. And then you come back to reality because you're on a bus, you have to get out and so on and so forth. Yeah. Same thing if you're doing sports and you're trying to aim at a target with a bow and an arrow. You're focusing on this thing. And as you're focusing on this thing, the fact that there are some people on the right and there's a bird that is flying on top of you and there's clouds, etc., all this stuff becomes less real. It's less part of your conscious processing. And you're very much into that space of hitting the target. And your body, musculature will respond, etc., etc. So what I'm saying is, what we're doing in hypnosis is we're simply potentiating this natural process that the mind goes into a lot of times when it's focused, when you're reading a book, when you're watching a film, when you're bored, and so on and so forth. And we are allowing it to go further. Mainly because you are sitting in a room with somebody and that's the purpose of what you're doing. So you can go further. You're not outside, you're not shooting an arrow, and you're not on a bus. And the way to do that is to utilize this, which we call induction, which is a very simple procedure. I mean, you do it in two main ways. One of them is eye fixation. So you look at a point. And this is something people use all over the world. They look at an image, for example, the image of a deity, the image of a yantra, a sort of geometric pattern or something, and they fixate their eyes there. So they reduce peripheral awareness, and through that they start going into a different kind of space of interaction with the world. And the other way to do that is entrainment, which is again is a fundamental function of our biology, which is the capacity that we have to set up our own physiological processes, and cognitive processes to synchronize with the pattern that is happening outside. This happens when you're listening to music, for example. You synchronize, or you start, let's say, tapping, or you start dancing, or you start singing. So you're synchronizing to something that is outside of you. And in other societies, this could be done, for example, by beating a drum. Yeah. So if you're a shaman in Siberia, or if you're in some parts of South America, you'll beat on a drum. You create a repetitive pattern. What happens is eventually your mind starts focusing, if it does focus on the repetitive pattern, starts noticing that there are no new stimuli. Nothing is going to happen whilst you're focusing on that repetitive pattern that has any importance to our cognitive faculties. And nothing new is going to really jump out of anywhere and eat you, which is the reason why we scan our environment constantly and we engage with stimuli. So you start going into a different space, and slowly you start being able to focus from the outside into the inside. So you bring your focus internally. Similar thing can be done when you repeat a mantra. You're activating the same process. It must exist because, yes, it allows us to be more suggestible, i.e. more capable of imagining other possibilities. So it allows us to become more creative. Where the creative process, the creation in the mind, through suggestion or through your own self-hypnosis, is experienced as real by the mind. That is what really makes suggestion in hypnosis different than just active imagination. If I tell you to imagine certain things, you're going to have to make an effort of some kind to imagine, to produce an imaginative sequence and to make it evolve. But in hypnosis, when we are experiencing these things, we're experiencing them as if we are not causing them directly. So they're effortless, and they feel real to the point that our brain is actually responding to them as if they were real. So if I'm saying to my hand that it's not feeling heat, and then I put it in a hot, pot of warm water, or heated water, my response in the brain will be that it's not responding to the heat. So this, of course, has a huge capacity to really change the way I might feel or experience certain things, because it's giving me a real experience without having to have the real experience. And then it's lodging that real experience into my mind so that it becomes part of my library of experiences. Now, in terms of evolutionary studies, what they thought is, well, trance must exist for what is called battle trance, i.e., when we had to kind of come together to, let's say, kill a mammoth or win over, rival something. People use drums. They went into a trance, and the trance allowed them to be less fearful, not feel pain, which are some of the things that happen in hypnosis. You are definitely less fearful. There's a reduction. In fact, there's an inhibition of the centers in the brain that perceive fear quite significantly, and also act in unison as a group, which of course makes you better at battle. Now, personally, I like to look at things in a more open-ended and open-minded way. If this certainly improved our chances of being good at battle, it also improved our chances of being good at all the other wonderful things that we can do as a group and as a collective, which is not just fighting and killing things, but is actually working together and establishing resonance and attunement amongst individuals so that they can come up with better solutions for their well-being in tribes and so on and so forth. And in fact, all traditional cultures have ways of creating these synchronizations and attunement so that they work together rather than against each other.
I think I understand now that trance is not only a state of mind that occurs during a clinical hypnotherapy session, but is actually accessible cross-culturally in many different practices. But when you're sitting one-on-one with a client, what does that actually look like in reality?
It's a very simple process. In fact, it's such a simple process that it's quite mind-blowing in a sense. What you do is you sit down, you have a conversation, which of course you need to have because you need to understand, the person needs to understand or formulate to some level what it is that they want to work with, or formulate the fact that they don't know what they want to work with. They just feel stuck. They feel inhibited in their creative work or in their their lives, their emotional lives, and they don't really know what is the goal. So you either come with a goal, or you come with the fact that you can't come up with a goal, and therefore that's part of the process. And in the conversational part, we're also creating, what is called a therapeutic alliance, which is, in psychotherapy is called rapport, i.e., you sit in a room with me or whoever else, you don't know me, you're kind of allowing me to hear and feel and sense and understand things that are very private often. That increases a sense of vulnerability. You need to feel safe. And you also need to feel some level of resonance with me, because you need to feel that you want to do this with me rather than do it with someone else. So the conversational part is to allow everyone to sort of settle into a place where they start feeling that it's okay to proceed onto doing some meaningful work. And for the practitioner to understand more or less what, I can start to understand both consciously and rationally and also unconsciously, and so therefore more on a inner felt level, might be what is important to work with. And then, which is one of the parts that I find more interesting, is we are then producing the induction process. The person accesses whatever level of hypnotic trance makes sense to them in that moment. The way I work is, permissively and indirectly, which is the sort of Ericksonian school, which is like, I'm not trying to knock you out into like this super deep trance immediately. I'm giving you the tools to go where you feel comfortable going. Our defenses, the things that we put up to sort of, make sure that we go only to a certain level are important. And it's important for the therapist not to just barge through walls and doors and push or drag the person into a place where they might not feel comfortable being at all. It has to be done, with a level of gentleness and a level of progression.
Does that mean in the early stages of a hypnotherapy journey, you might not do an induction on session 1?
No, I wouldn't. I resonate with the concept that time is precious. To people is precious, first of all, because it's an investment of money, and not everybody has a huge amount of money to just dedicate on their own self-improvement. And also because I think it's important for someone to immediately have a feeling of what it feels to be in hypnosis, so they can make the choice and they can have an informed call of whether that's where they want to proceed with this process of healing or therapy, or actually something else is better suited to them. Now, once the person is in hypnosis, and that again has different ways of being felt and being made sense of, because not only it changes, it has a layered and complex sort of way of progressing. Again, if somebody takes something even as material as, let's say, a magic mushroom, psilocybin, they will report very different internal experiences of what that feels like to them. So there's a huge variation. Yeah. Secondly, of course, all of us have different levels of literacy in terms of how we make sense of what we experience internally. Okay. So our interception is different depending on what kind of experiences in life I've had and how much I've paid attention to them. And my sensitivity as a human being changes depending on, what is my history, physical, mental, somatic, psychological, what are my traumas, etc., etc. Somebody might be very sensitive and very, very capable of making sense of what's going on internally. Some other people might feel very sort of hazy about it or disoriented about it or not even capable of formulating it to their own self-awareness. Yeah. And in fact, the process of any therapeutic process that has a somatic dynamic like hypnosis does is also, to me, to give avenue and give space for someone to learn how they can make sense of what they feel, how they can make sense of what they experience, because that's going to be very helpful, i.e. to refine and sharpen and expand their awareness of their awareness and their capacity to tune in sensitively to their bodies. Because there's a lot of wisdom in that is very helpful in life if we can tune into these processes with some level of literacy and some level of understanding. Once we do this, or once, let's say, the person is in hypnosis, then what we do is, in different ways, we work with suggestion. And suggestion sometimes is verbal, i.e. something is sort of presented to the mind and the body as an invitation to wonder and an invitation to be curious about the possibility of a certain process. Okay? Or as an invitation to look for a certain library of better adjusted experiences that might serve your current situation. Meaning, let's say I'm very stressed and anxious. When I'm stressed and anxious, I have a tendency to edit my life and compress everything into stress and anxiety. Like, this is all I've ever experienced in my life. And that's true to some people that have suffered, more extensive trauma or have had really, really difficult lives. But it's most likely not entirely true to the vast majority of people. I.e., you have had also a lot of other experiences where you didn't feel anxiety and you didn't feel stress in the same way. But our mind, as a way of packing those up all in the background, like they're behind a screen or behind a wall, and just stay in the anxiogenic state. And what I can do in hypnosis, I can suggest for the person to start exploring and potentially finding that actually there is a library of other experiences which give them the awareness that there are options, that there have been options in their lives. They are not stuck in this, concrete block. They are navigating a much more fluid reality. And that immediately then, for some reason, seems to give the mind the option to make more choices. So we're not, again, cornered in a very compressed corner, but we have a wider space.
When somebody's in a trance, they are very psychologically vulnerable. So how do you mitigate this risk and make sure that people remain psychologically safe?
So I mean, there are people who have indeed had experience of life from a very early age that have been so awful and so violent or traumatic that it would be very difficult for them to resonate with that process of, oh, let's look at this possibility. In that case, there are different ways to work, and one of them is that what you do is you first work on a very baseline way in which their bodies cannot self-regulate. And this is where the non-verbal suggestion comes into the picture, which is really important in hypnosis. I.e., you can work with the breath, you can work with the way in which the body is out of kilter, and you do this in ways that are not verbally coded. So they don't work through conceptual thinking, and therefore, the memory material of conceptual thinking. You're bypassing this entirely, and this is something that I think works in every practice that is not just verbalized. Yeah. So if one of the main ways in which hypnosis works is that the practitioner has himself to go into a light trance state. So you lead by example. And in all therapeutic setting, whatever therapy you approach, if you're holding a picture in your mind, let's simplify to that level, of the problems that the patient has, rather than holding in your mind the possibility that the patient might explore and experience things differently, i.e. you are holding a positive representation, very unlikely you're going to have a positive outcome. I mean, this has been studied extensively. Yeah. So I have myself to go into a state where I'm not riddled with fears and doubts and anxiety, or I'm not going to be able to do anything good with you. Yeah. No matter what technique I use. And once I do that, then I can start, because we resonate, because, attunement and synchronization are the baseline mechanism through which we develop from fetal prenatal states, where we're attuning and synchronizing with the heartbeat and the breathing pattern of our mothers, which is the first thing we experience, in our existence. We're suspended in water and we're hearing a heartbeat that is very regular and goes up and down. Sometimes the mother is anxious, goes faster, sometimes it goes lower, etc., etc. Our heartbeat synchronizes, of course, and our breathing pattern, the mother breathing pattern moves the diaphragm, and that moves us and creates a sound, and so on and so forth. So these are, I think, for a very logical reason, the ways in which we can co-regulate interpersonally with another human being. That goes beyond the conceptual, beyond what can be verbalized, beyond what can be retrieved in memory, and goes at an autonomic level of function. So what I would say is, unless we're talking about psychopathology or personality disorders, in which case we're talking about things that are much more complex, unlikely they would be worked in the context of a simple hypnotherapy session. I mean, someone like that will have, psychiatric care and so on and so forth. If we're talking about someone who's stuck in very badly into a very traumatic experience, what you would do is you will find ways of helping them regulate and going back and forth in the regulator attunement and disattunement. So they start experiencing a different mind-body state, a different neuromuscular state, a different autonomic state. Once we shift that, once these states change, once our bodies and our autonomic responses start becoming different, then I can start connecting with a wider field than just myself. That just my narrative, my trauma, my collapsing, because all of these things can only exist in a disjointed state, in a divided state, in a separation. And so the point of being with someone in a room and doing therapy is that the first thing you're doing is you're trying to create a relational space, and you're preparing yourself to be in a state where you can allow that relational space to be safe, of course, but also grounding, calming, and so on and so forth. And then the moment the person starts being able to go a little bit out of this collapsed and frozen and traumatized state, closer to what's outside, because there's a bigger world, of course, than my very negative experience of life. There's a world where there are flowers that are blossoming, there are bees that are flying around, not that many left, but there are. There are penguins who have a different kind of state of mind than mine. There are children who are playing as much as their children are crying. So if we start broadening our ecological awareness, then we cannot but start connecting with resources, because this is our human nature.
On average, how long will a hypnotized person remain in a trance state throughout a normal session?
It depends, but I think I would say an average of 40 minutes. Sometimes longer. Yes. Sometimes it's an in and out process. You're fractioning the trance. So you're going in, you're doing certain things, you're coming out, you're going in again, and so on and so forth, depending what the process is about. And some of the trance involves actually activating physical responses, motor responses, and joining them with, internal processing, emotional, behavioral, or cognitive processes. So it could be something that actually is experienced through movement rather than, being quiet.
Is there a particular patient or case that made you realize that you love this job?
I would say that, and I mean this very honestly, generally most of the work when it's meaningful and makes me really feel that this is what I want to do in life. Yeah. And the first time I hypnotized someone, which was in the first course I ever took, and I did this because the exercise was to do so by just breathing and sort of blinking the eyes, and barely talking. And the person went into hypnosis. I felt this is an extraordinary tool. I cannot believe that something so simple can achieve such an extraordinary shift in our consciousness and an embodied state. And that you can notice when this is happening, when the person shifts, from this to hypnosis, that immediately some kind of vital well-being is being activated. Anymore that, if you see people meditating and they're not having a terrible time meditating because they don't really, they're struggling and they're trying to do things in meditation they shouldn't be trying to do, they just usually look like they're having a pretty good time. They look like they're in a place where things feel sort of meaningfully resonant and whole. Yeah. And same thing in psychedelic experiences, most people seem to be having a pretty good time. Now, of course, there can also be powerful shifts that are happening on a physical, emotive level, which take, the shape of tears and so on and so forth. But it's that's the whole point. That's why we're alive. That's why we're not, I'm not a radiator. As a space where you get to have this amazing opportunity and the privilege of joining up with another human being, doing something incredible in terms of the fact that, someone allows themselves to go into very meaningful connection and discover and reconnect with themselves. It's very enthusing. It's very beautiful. Now, obviously, the point of being a therapist is you don't just want your patients, your clients, to constantly be going through amazing, powerful shifts. I have a bias. I love amazing, powerful shifts. But if the person is just going through something very quiet and gentle and slow, and because that's what they need, I appreciate that process too. It doesn't have to be turned into a blockbuster, so to speak.
Is there any specific case that you feel comfortable sharing?
This is done in literature, etc. I think there's something personally that I don't like so much about the anecdotal tales, because a lot of them go around a little bit of what's really wrong with the way hypnosis is presented in a lot of cases by a lot of people, i.e. this kind of wizardry school is like, Dumbledore is in the room and it's going to transform the person into a phoenix, yeah? And that makes a lot of people think that it has to be like that. It's either Harry Potter or you're being cheated or you're wrong. There's something wrong with you. You're not working the right way. And that's bullshit. And sometimes it's a very subtle process and it's a recurrently complex process. But, there have been many instances where I come out of a session and I feel that I've just witnessed something profound in the sense of midwifery, like seeing a birth of some kind. And there's something that resonates in any human being when you see some element of the self, the psyche, or the connection between mind and body being either birthed or rebirthed or reconnected. It has a really interesting way of impacting on the space around us. And we know this because we have experienced those things with other human beings, of course, friends, partners, family, children, and so on and so forth. And, I do it for work, which is great. And it would be as exciting if I was working with horses, to be honest, and seeing the way animals can can shift their emotional patterns and their states, because of course, you know, mammals have capacities which we have, and so on and so forth. But it just happens that what I do is human based.
Did you experience or come to recognize the profound shift that hypnotherapy can bring by doing it as an individual? Or was it only during your training that you made this discovery?
I went into it blindfolded. I didn't know anything about it truly, except these vague ideas. So I started experiencing it in the trainings. And then I realized that it has a very similar way of allowing these meaningful shifts and these meaningful adaptations and these meaningful learnings, just like other approaches do, you know, which I've also tried and experimented with.
Have you got any self-hypnosis practices which you could share with the audience?
No, I mean, this is absolutely, I think it is recommended. First of all, it's probably likely that people go into some form of self-hypnosis or light self-hypnosis. As I was saying, you know, when they get really involved into a book they're reading, or they get involved into their daydreaming. Okay. As per how you can utilize techniques to take yourself deeper into a self-hypnotic state, that's something that will depend on how good you are at doing that. So there's a huge varied capacity and skill there. Some people will be very good at doing this. Some people will find it very, very, very hard to do. And of course, when you do it with someone who's guiding you, it becomes immediately easier. Because in general, things become immediately easier to us when someone is guiding us into them. Because it takes away, again, the self-reflexive and self-reflective awareness of, am I doing this? Should I do this? Should I do that? All the decisional part becomes less of an issue. Yeah. And secondly, because indeed we come about through the body of another human being. We don't form, our nervous system does not just pop into existence out of thin air. Poof. But it forms itself into the interrelation with the nervous system of another human and the body and all the physiological responses and the cognitive and psychological responses. So when we join with another person, whether it's a practitioner or just another person, we are able to go much further than when we're doing things by ourselves. By ourselves we can, but it takes a lot more work and a lot more constancy and a lot more practice. As per techniques, I mean, one way could be to listen to certain kinds of sounds that work through entrainment. So it could be repetitive sound for some people, it could be something like a heartbeat, it could be something like a drum beat. For someone else, it could be something that has a kind of more monotonous, more kind of drony nature. And then, simply focusing on the breath and focusing on being sort of slowly kind of drawing attention internally rather than externally. Or you could do that, i.e. utilizing the sounds, and then utilize fixation, eye fixation. So you could be looking at something. It could be a point in the floor. It could be a candle, the end of a candle. And again, depending on your own already developed internal skills, you might find those processes very easy or a little bit more complicated, in which case you will have to reiterate and try it again. Or you could simply, go somewhere, try being hypnotized, and then see how it works. So you have an awareness of it and then develop it yourself. Anxiety has major ways of being impacted by hypnosis. Insomnia is something I worked with, hundreds of times. Again, something that, people have tried all kinds of things, and then, a couple of sessions and they are sleeping, basically. I've worked with agoraphobia. Again, extreme situations where someone hadn't been able to really conceive getting out and being around people, and a month later, after a number of treatments, they're sitting in a cinema and they don't even remember that they were panicking just at the idea of being around a bunch of people. The overall place from which someone experiences disconnection with their craft, their work, their family, their loved ones, humanity, the environment. So anything that has to do with that kind of pattern of disconnection, you can work in hypnosis very powerfully. So you can reignite someone's resources in terms of creativity, purpose, meaningfulness, or in terms of how they, are constantly going into a clash with people they care about, their anger and so on and so forth. And in other situations, I worked with bizarre sort of presenting symptoms, or presenting symptoms that I thought, well, this is definitely not something I can work with. But the person was like, well, I tried everything. So, and there's like chronic, like certain very acute back pains. And then what happens is, in some cases, the body goes into an interesting state, which is a particular kind of hypnotic state or trance state, where muscles actually activate. And it seems like the muscles are intelligently, through the nervous system, of course, finding ways to change whatever, neuromuscular lock has been acquired by probably unpleasant experiences, and slowly finding a way of releasing it and readapting. And it's a really physical process. It's got very little to do with any storytelling and metaphors and stuff. And then the person comes out and their back pain is reduced significantly.
At the end of a session, when a patient or client goes back out into the community and they experience something that is troubling or distressing, do you think that they are tapping into micro trances as a result of the work done in the clinical room?
It depends. It depends. Depends on what we're talking about, what's going on with the person. In some cases, in quite a number of cases, it will work very well long term. The level to which, let's say, the panic attacks will be notched out consistently. So they will never ever go above a certain level that the bar is seriously lower. Obviously, if you then go through a year of really awful stress and experiences, it's likely that your mind and your body, your nervous system, your somatic system will go back into doing what they need to do to deal with this, which is having very strong symptoms, in which case you get more treatment, or whether it's hypnosis or something else. You know what I'm saying? If all of a sudden you feel very unwell, you should get help. What happens, I think, is when we work with something like hypnosis, in general, it makes us more capable to tuning in and being in touch with what's going on, so that we are more able to notice what is a good idea and what is not a good idea. Yeah, and this is, in general, I think with therapeutic processes, you're starting just, if that wasn't there before, because let's say it wasn't taught to you, it wasn't shown to you in your family, in your upbringing, by your community, and so on and so forth, you start just having a better meter and a more sensitive meter that makes you understand, okay, actually, this is clearly not making me feel well. So perhaps if I continue engaging with it, I'm not going to feel well. And this is making me feel better. So if I continue engaging with this, it makes me feel better. Because sometimes the lack of experience is so deep within our context as we grow up, that we don't know how to recognize what really makes us feel not well at all. And we just don't sense it.
Could hypnotherapy be used for addiction or even social media addiction?
I mean, in most people that feel a disconnection with life, huge levels of anxiety, feel that time is eroded to the point that everything is very fast, and that their head is stuffy and sort of overwhelmed, I usually ask, what's your use of social media? What's your use of digital devices? Because I think it's hugely impactful, and I think every study that's been done on this subject is demonstrating it's hugely impactful. And then what we're going to do is to start working on getting them into a place where this addiction to stress, addiction to all of these different, very constricted overstimulation spaces can actually mellow out and expand.